In 1631, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the tiny Irish fishing village of Baltimore was ripped from its sleep by screams. Barbary pirates from North Africa smashed down doors, dragged men, women, and children from their beds, chained them in the streets while their homes burned behind them. Before the sun rose, all 237 souls were loaded onto ships and carried across the sea to Algiers. Among them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook, a girl who had never left her village, never dreamed that men from a world she couldn't even imagine would come for her in the dead of night. 3 weeks later, Joan stood naked on a slave platform in the Algiers market. Buyers circled her like cattle traders, squeezing her arms, running rough hands down her body, forcing open her mouth to check her teeth. She was sold for the price of 8 oxen, cheaper than a decent horse. And Joan was not alone. Between 1530 and 1780, more than 1 million Europeans, Spaniards, Italians, French, English, Dutch, even Icelanders and Irish, were captured and sold into slavery in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. This is the story Europe chose to bury, because admitting it meant admitting that for 250 years the Mediterranean was a slave market where Europeans were the merchandise. And what happened to the women once they reached the harems? That is the part no one wants you to hear. To understand Joan's fate, and the fate of a million others, you must first understand who took them. These were not random pirates. They were the Barbary corsairs, state-sponsored predators based in Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Sale. The Ottoman Empire armed them, protected them, and took a fat tax on every slave sold. This wasn't piracy. This was big business. Their fleets, sometimes 30 ships strong, struck at night or at dawn when villages lay helpless. They took gold, silver, food. But people were the real prize. A human being could be sold, used, and sold again until nothing remained. In 1627, they sailed all the way to Iceland and carried off 400 people from an island most Europeans had never even heard of. Imagine an Icelandic farmer waking to Arabic voices kicking in his door. Men from a continent he couldn't point to on any map. In 1544, Harrowing Barbarossa swept the Italian coast and took 7,000 souls in a single summer. In 1554, the corsairs emptied the Spanish town of Vieste. 6,000 people gone in one night. These were not raids. These were harvests. They targeted young women and children because they fetched the highest prices. For 2.5 centuries, coastal families in Spain, Italy, France, and beyond went to bed every night wondering if tonight was the night they would wake up in chains. Entire villages were abandoned. People fled inland. Watchtowers rose along every shore. Church bells rang warnings. But the corsairs learned the weak villages, bribed local traders, waited for storms that kept fishing boats in harbor, and then they struck. Some Europeans, called renegades, actually joined them. Men like Simon the Dancer, a Dutch captain who converted, became one of the richest corsairs in Algiers, and personally sold thousands of his own people. Money, it turned out, had no nationality. Let me tell you about another woman, Maria Terrelin, a 22-year-old Dutch girl captured in 1731 on a merchant ship off Spain. The pirates showed no mercy to men over 40. They threw them overboard like garbage. The young men and all the women were chained below deck. Maria spent 17 days in total darkness, chained shoulder to shoulder with 40 other women. The hold stank of vomit, urine, and terror. 7 women died on that crossing. Maria sat chained to one corpse for hours before the guards noticed. When they finally dragged her onto the deck in Algiers, the sunlight felt like knives in her eyes. The slave market was brutally efficient. Captives were washed, wounds patched just enough to keep them alive for sale. Strong young men went to the galleys, chained to oars, rowing until they dropped dead within 5 years. Educated men became tutors or craftsmen. Children were trained as servants. Women over 35 became domestic slaves. But girls aged 15 to 30? They were the most expensive cargo of all, destined for the harems. Before the auction came the inspection. Young women were paraded on raised platforms in public squares. Buyers squeezed limbs, checked teeth, examined every inch of skin. In Algiers and Tunis, nothing was hidden. French priest Pierre Dan, who rescued captives in 1634, wrote that Christian women were stripped and touched everywhere while crowds watched. Any girl who cried or resisted was beaten until she learned silence. Joan Broadbrook stood on that same platform. A simple Irish village girl whose biggest worry had once been the harvest. Now strangers' hands were all over her body while she was priced like livestock. She was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed for 8 oxen. 6 weeks later she reached Istanbul, locked in another dark hold with 20 other European women who spoke languages she couldn't understand. Fear needed no translation. At Ahmed's house the other slaves stripped away her European clothes and burned them. They bathed her in perfume, dressed her in Ottoman silk, and that same night Ahmed came to her room. Joan had never been touched by any man. In her village such things happened only after marriage, with someone who spoke her language and knew her name. Ahmed needed neither. Years later she smuggled a letter home, one of the few surviving voices from those women. She wrote only that she wished for death 1,000 times that first night. But death never came. And every night after was the same. That was the true face of the harem. Not silk cushions and romantic paintings, but captivity, forced submission, and the slow torture of knowing this would never end. Some women went mad. Others went numb. All were pressured to convert. Conversion never brought freedom, only slightly less cruelty. They were forced to learn Turkish or Arabic. They had zero legal rights. They could not refuse their owner anything, could not own anything, could not even leave the house without permission. They were property, nothing more. Most ended up in one of 3 hells. Endless domestic labor with daily beatings, concubinage where they competed for their owner's attention, a son improved their status, a daughter did not, or being resold again and again. Each sale another public inspection, another new master, another fresh trauma. But the most feared fate of all was the imperial harem inside Topkapi Palace. A city of 500 to 1,000 women, almost all property. Circassian and Georgian girls were preferred, but European beauties were rare prizes. Only the most perfect, usually aged 12 to 18, survived the brutal selection. Inside, they spent years training in music, dance, etiquette, seduction. Yet here is the truth that destroys every fantasy. Out of 1,000 women, only 50 or 100 would ever even meet the Sultan. Maybe 5 or 10 in an entire generation would ever spend a night with him. The rest lived and died in gilded cages, waiting decades for a summons that never came, growing old behind marble walls. Ottoman records still preserve the story of one European girl known only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at 15. She died there in 1702 at 67, 52 years inside those walls. She never once saw the Sultan. Her grave bore no name, only the number 847 and 2 words: origin, Franco. Cause, advanced age. Europe let this horror continue for 250 years because Europe was too busy killing itself. Catholics against Protestants, endless religious wars. Some nations even made profitable treaties with the Ottomans and looked the other way. Ransom became a business, but only the rich could pay. Most captives never came home. Maria Terelin was one of the lucky ones. After 8 years, her family sold everything they owned to buy her freedom. When she finally returned to Holland in 1739, she found her fiancé married to someone else, her mother dead from grief, her father ruined, and her own community treating her like damaged goods. In her diary she wrote that she wished she had died in captivity. At least there her shame had been private. The nightmare ended only in 1830 when France invaded Algeria and crushed the Corsair states. By then, over 1 million Europeans had vanished into the system. Most were never seen again. Joan Broadbrook eventually won her freedom too. But when she returned to Ireland, Baltimore was gone, her entire village erased. Her family had prayed for her every Sunday for decades until even the prayers stopped. She was forgotten. This is not just Joan's story, or Maria's, or Francesca's. This is the story of more than 1 million European women whose lives were stolen by an open, legal system of human trafficking that lasted centuries. The coasts of Ireland still whisper about that night in 1631. The archives of Istanbul still list the slave numbers. And now you remember too. Every civilization has its buried darkness. Which one should we open next? Tell me in the comments.